Okay, welcome to the International Spy Museum. I'm Peter Ernest, the Executive Director. I am delighted to see all of you here. I would ask those who are still undercover to keep their badges turned inward. And I would like to take special note and welcome Don Kerr, who is the Deputy Director of National Intelligence. And Don, it's a pleasure to have you here. We know the burdens you're carrying, and to take a few moments out to be here is just wonderful. Tonight we are very privileged to have a very distinguished officer from the CIA with a very extensive operational background, Bob Wallace. He was, I should point out by the way, a combat veteran of Vietnam, where he was a team leader for one of the long-range reconnaissance units, came back with 2 Bronze Stars and a combat infantryman's badge. He was a Ranger. He went into the agency in 1971 and had a distinguished career both as an operations officer, a case officer, as well as holding a number of senior management jobs. He then went on to be the director of the Office of Technical Services. He was, in effect, for those of you who are moderately familiar with English literature, Q. He is the closest thing we will have to Q. He directed all of those who did the technical support for operations, which was quite extraordinary through the Cold War, and there's no reason to believe it's not still quite extraordinary. He is still a consultant both to the government and in the private sector, and he is the co-author of this remarkable book. The other co-author is Keith Melton, who is a very renowned author, The Ultimate Spy. Many of you are familiar with that. He was an Annapolis graduate. He has had an extremely successful career as a businessman, and he currently has the largest private collection of espionage, military weapons artifacts in the world, and serves as a founding director on one of our advisory directors on the museum. Part of his collection is currently in CIA in their Cold War display. He has been very generous with his knowledge. He is currently an advisor to intelligence agencies particularly on the technical side of operations. He has done several presentations here, extremely well received. We're absolutely delighted to have them here. Their book is a remarkable achievement. I think those of us with a background in intelligence, certainly in CIA, are stunned that they got this much through the Publications Review Board. It was not, I understand, an easy task. They had to deal with a series of directors and a series of people who thought their individual chapters were great, but if we put them all together, it's classified. I don't know how many of you have worked in that arcane world, but both understanding it and trying to get through it is a formidable task. They were successful. I don't know offhand of a more detailed book now on a CIA office through this period of time than there is in this book. I also am not familiar with any single volume that has the operational highlights in dealing with real agents, with real situations, as there are in this book. I think for those of us who are professionals, it is a thriller. And I think those of you who are interested in this, obviously all of you are going to be equally excited on reading this book. We do have copies. We got them in Friday. This is pretty close timing, guys. We got them in Friday, and both Bob and Keith will be available to sign the books in the back of the room after the presentation. So we will go ahead, introduce them both. They will make their presentation and take questions immediately afterwards. Those of you who've been here before know there are facilities in the back of the room just outside the door. And I would ask, by the way, since this is quite a full group, if those of you who have cell phones would put them on vibrate or silence them, that would be a big help. And there is over here to your left a small display of artifacts being overseen by Dr. Thomas Bogart, who is our museum historian, and I believe either Keith or Bob will expand on those. Don Kerr, welcome, and Keith and Bob, we are just delighted to have you here. Please help me welcome Bob Wallace and Keith Melton.
Good evening. We are honored that you took time this evening to join us and be part of this presentation. This is going to be tag team, although not wrestling, we hope. And so I'll make a couple of remarks on some of our graphics, and then Keith will, and then I'll come back and we'll continue that through the presentation. It's an amazing story. It's an amazing world of OTS, one that I really was not exposed to until later in my career in the fullness of what this office really was able to accomplish. So our goals for tonight are to focus on the work of these members of Q. In America, the American Q are the men and women of OTS that make support to clandestine operations, make technical support to clandestine operations work. So, historically, the intelligence business began in the United States in a major way with OSS during the Second World War, and the OSS technical equipment tend to emphasize sabotage, lethal things, stuff that blow up. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, because of the challenges posed by the Soviet Union, we were faced with the need to infiltrate people back in behind the Soviet bloc, and so the emphasis on technical support began to shift, and you will see several shifts of that during this evening's presentation. And this shift was, what do we need to get people inside, back behind the Iron Curtain? Well, we needed documents, we needed clothing, we needed vehicles, we needed hot air balloons. And that perhaps was one of the first significant developments of OTS in terms of the work that it did that transferred into the private sector. We are looking at collection. Now, as the years pass, we are into the early 1960s. The Soviet Union has now become a primary collection target for our intelligence operations, and so we get things like U-2s and satellites and audio. COVCOM dominated OTS and technical work for the last 2 decades of the 20th century. It doesn't do you any good to have an agent if you can't communicate with him. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of espionage is agent communication with the handler. And finally, into the 21st century, it is a digital revolution, and one of the reasons that we were able to write SPYCRAFT was that the basis for much of the technical work now done in espionage operations lies in the digital world. So, this is the book. The only additional author note that I would make to what Peter said is that it has been gratifying that so many people have expressed interest in the book, and particularly so many technical officers have said, yes, we think it was time this was done. Our goals were 3. 1 was to honor the technical officers. 2 was to fill a void in American intelligence history. And the 3rd was to give the American public a sense of pride of what their intelligence agency was doing. 50th anniversary of OTS was celebrated 3 days before the events of September 2001. Don Kerr was the recently installed Director of Science and Technology, to whom I reported as Director of the Office of Technical Service. We had a terrific celebration on that occasion, and to highlight that, we invited the man who has the world's most extensive collection of spy gear, at least privately, that we know of to date, and a man who has established himself as really one of America's top intelligence historians, Keith Melton. And I said to Keith, I said, talk about where the real Q came from. Keith?
Director Kerr, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure, as much because for us, the work is done, and this is the pleasure is talking about the book and the experience. And both Bob and I have been most appreciative of the support and assistance of one individual who was instrumental in the organization and structure of our book, Hank Schlesinger. Where is Hank? And where's Harry? He raised his hand. Hank, thank you so much. That was he was our writer and helped us a great deal. Well, the world of clandestine technology is often framed in the reference of our cinematic experience. And perhaps no single event transformed public opinion as the character that was created by Ian Fleming and James Bond. And when President Kennedy took the first book, Dr. No, for a beach read, it ultimately led to the creation of Dr. No, the movie, later From Russia with Love, and it became a phenomenon. And still many people in the community as well as the public reference that. And it is some of the memorable scenes from a movie such as From Russia with Love that create the idea of what a technical marvel and the magician that creates gadgets should be. And this is just a clip from Russia from Love that some of you may remember.
Out she comes.
Q's Deadly Briefcase is a huge hit with audiences. It features gold coins, hidden ammo, an AR-7 folding sniper's rifle with infrared telescopic sight, and a tear gas cartridge disguised as a tin of talc.
You got it? Yes, I think so.
Certainly many people wanted it, and it was, we're going to show you later if you have time, we do have one of a real agency briefcase, which is a vintage concealment briefcase. Because what many of you know that are in the intelligence community, but the public generally never realize, is that the world of espionage as framed by Ian Fleming through James Bond is about two things, and I hope in the correct order: seduction and assassination. Where in the real world, it's about information and communication. And so much of the efforts that Bob and his colleagues did is find ways for our sources and our assets to do that securely and secretly. And this is something that has been the focus. But Bob's charge to me was, well, who is Q? Because clearly this is a national interest in Great Britain, and our good friends are here. And there is a right to think that actor Desmond Llewellyn truly framed the character. Now, interestingly, if you love the trivia, the character of Q, Major Quentin Boothroyd, does not appear in the original Ian Fleming Bond novels. He was created in the Bond movies itself, and Desmond Llewellyn framed the character. Interestingly, when I had the opportunity to meet with him about a dozen years ago, he passed away in 1999, he says, "Keith, I don't know a bloody thing about technology, but it's so wonderful in the movies because it doesn't have to work." Bob's point is, it not only has to work, but it has to work the first time, every time, under incredible conditions. And when it fails to work, you can't do a retake. It may cost someone their life. But Q was an interesting character. So who could it be? Well, two characters in Great Britain during World War II, Charles Fraser Smith, the master of the escape gadgets, and the true head of one of MI9's escape section, Clayton Hutton, were immediate people to consider, but their frame and their work was focused more on escape and evasion. If we come to this country, we find that Stanley Lovell, who would be known as Dr. Moriarty for the OSS, probably was much closer, but the original focus in World War II was either kill things or blow them up. The subtleties of collecting information and counterintelligence really didn't come about towards the end of the war. So we were a bit stymied, and we kept searching. And truly, when we discovered and we looked through the historical record, the comprehensive nature of Q in providing support to intelligence is closely embodied by the men and women of the technical services of the CIA. And truly, they are the real Q. So in that spirit, we take great respect to our British colleagues, but it is an American in the way it's been employed. Stanley Lovell was was Bill Donovan's Dr. Moriarty, and we was faced at a time that America was unprepared. We had a very nascent intelligence service. We were going into a global conflict, and this is the beginning of the first in truly global intelligence war, and Lovell had to create the gadgets. He worked for Wild Bill Donovan, Medal of Honor winner with the Fighting 69th in World War I, legendary Republican multimillionaire lawyer from New York, and he put together essentially the first centralized intelligence agency during the war. There were two organizations, OSS, Office of Strategic Services, and Office of Scientific Research and Development, which technically reported directly to President Roosevelt. Beneath that was the National Defense Research Committee, and Lovell headed then what would be known as Division 19. He also jointly was the head of the research and development for OSS. And with the two organizations, Division 19 had its laboratories called the Maryland Research Lab, which is at now the Congressional Country Club. And some of the scenes you'll see were filmed actually at OSS facilities up near the present-day Camp David. And he was the man that was in charge of making it happen. Now, most of the public reference is to one of the classic movies from 1946 with Alan Ladd, and here's actually the trailer from the movie.
If you had known this story a year ago, your life would have been in peril based on the incredible real-life adventures of men who challenged breathless danger with the odds 17 million to 1 against them.
With Ladd at his fighting romantic best and Geraldine Fitzgerald as his lovely partner in Dave's life.
Sudden death. What was the fateful message of this flickering light?
These are just a few of the fascinating clues in the most harrowing, heart-stopping manhunt in screen history.
Notice the focus of the movie: romantic adventure, heroism, incredible odds, and blowing things up. So the realities of fighting this global war, we were in survival mode, and paramilitary operations were paramount. Intelligence collection came later. Now, interestingly, John Ford headed a film training group within OSS, and here is the training film they produced at the time to talk about the exploits of OSS.
In a conflict fought on 100 constantly changing fronts, opportunity has arisen for the use of small bands of highly trained irregulars to be injected behind enemy lines. With almost certain death as the penalty for capture, these men must operate toward the utmost destruction of property and life. Their only chance of survival depends upon extreme ingenuity, an intimate knowledge of the country, and the confidence born of months of training and study.
Kind of interesting to note when one of the OSS operatives he throws the grenade, the explosive through the window. It's interesting, he didn't pick the lock and go in and rifle the safe. He's just interested in destroying the building. But towards the mid-1940s, it was clear the outcome of World War II. There was the necessity to move to intelligence collection. But still there was a recognition that equipment needed to be provided. This is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek look at a cigarette pistol that appeared in one of the recent reviews of our book. There really was such a thing. But it wasn't an assassination piece. It was, if you're having a founding intelligence service and you're sending operatives behind enemy lines, what if they need to escape? Well, if you have very little of an organized history, perhaps you could produce a small weapon, a .22 caliber pistol inside of a cigarette, have it so you can bite the tip, pull it, it'll fire, make an extremely loud noise, especially in a closed space, a car or an office. It won't hurt anyone, but you'll perhaps have the opportunity to escape. And weapons like that were deemed fanciful, but we didn't really have a heritage or a history to understand. A very creative piece was the Liberator pistol of the Woolworth. It was made by the Guide Lamp division of General Motors. It cost a few dollars. It was designed to be mass-produced as an automobile and distribute to partisan. However, when we look to Europe, leaders there were very wisely thinking that if we arm many of the partisans, the only thing they probably hate worse than the Germans is each other. And the new government taking over in France may end up fighting these same partisans who want a communist government. So they wanted to degrade the weapon to the point it would be inaccurate past 6 feet. And the idea was create a weapon, kill a sentry, and get a gun. And it's part of the creativity that was utilized. Of the OSS Special Devices catalog in 1944, about 95% of the devices, either for assassination or sabotage or explosion. One of the few is a 16 millimeter camera that was a run of 500 produced by Kodak. And it was the first U.S. intelligence produced spy camera. Yet this is a photograph it took in Washington in 1944. But even then, it was a casing camera to do surveillance of a target. There was a rarely produced accessory that would photograph documents, but essentially you're gathering information on future places you wanted to attack. However, if you did have secret information, there was a pyrofilm notebook that would destroy all the documents within 30 seconds if you'd simply pull the tab and toss it behind a building. Now, creating gadgets and gizmos. There was a process created during World War II in which, as opposed to many intelligence services, British service, the Russian service, where they actually produce their own gadgets internally. OSS founded a model in which it works with academia and private contractors to actually produce the items that are designed or the design is influenced internally. And many of the questions that are often asked, well, where do the ideas for some of these gadgets come up? They traditionally come either from a request from the field to solve a problem, or an officer within the organization has a new application for an existing piece of technology, or they survey new technologies being developed. But more often, they rely on submissions either from contractors and occasionally from interested individuals. And during World War II, the U.S. president was fortunate to receive numerous letters from passionate citizens who had great ideas to help the country. Perhaps all of them pale in comparison to the infamous Project X-ray, or the bat bomb, which was designed by a dentist and submitted to the president. It eventually went down into the National Defense Research Committee in Division 19, and the concept was very simple. If you take a bat that wants a dark, clever hiding place, and you deploy it from a parachute at several thousand feet over Tokyo, and in it are thousands of bats, each one carrying tiny thermite incendiaries. They'll swoop down at 100 miles an hour, look into Tokyo, find a dark place to nest, and then at midnight the little timer goes off and you'd create a firestorm that burned down Tokyo. And indeed, they found bats, healthy, virile bats that were able to fly well and carry the loads, and they actually produced devices that worked. Now, fortunately for us, the war ended before it was ever deployed. They found that bats do not travel well, and after a long period of travel, somehow objected to the fact that they were being ejected from the canister at several thousand feet, and often they became, in effect, dive bombs themselves. But there was a proof of concept. And in 1943, inadvertently, they burned down one of our own U.S. Army Air Force facilities, but it proved that the concept didn't work. So another interesting challenge, especially in 1943, it was clear, as Bob had mentioned, that we were going to have to infiltrate and exfiltrate agents. Well, the concept was created. What if we could find a way to drop a package to an agent, have them somehow erect a cord, let a plane swoop over, catch it in a hook, and let's pull the agent up to safety? We could pull someone out of anywhere. Now, could that work? Actually, in September the 5th, Alexis Doster, an OSS officer, became the first person to be so lifted. And I thought you might like to see the film of him doing that. This is a slow motion of the plane coming over. Now, this is a test load calculated at 180 pounds. In slow motion, it's being pulled up. But they needed a live subject. The first airborne subject was a sheep, Betty the sheep. In fact, the sheep is going up now, and it's being pulled up. Betty made 3 successive lifts in harness without being relieved, and at the end was very happy to come away unscathed and get as far away from the airplane as possible. Now, this is Lieutenant Doster, who's prepared, knees up, coming over, and the lift is made, and he was the first man to go from ground to space that quickly, precisely about 170 miles an hour. Now, the idea worked, but it was so late in the war it was never deployed. But the early technical service staff remembered the experiment. So, in the 1950s, Robert Fulton, a man who developed the amphibious car, had the idea, let's take the same concept and simply put the line with a helium balloon, and we'll have the opportunity to have a plane fly over and with a fork and catch it. And in 1958, a CIA employee, a pilot, Alan Pope, was in peril in Southeast Asia, and actually this was one of the last 2 plans that were considered to rescue him. But the need was great, so what if we could parachute down a rubber inflatable airplane, something many of you have perhaps considered? Well, actually, Goodyear developed such a plane. It had a speed of 70 miles an hour, and the concept was simple. Drop the package, let the agent assemble it. One man could do it, 2 men would be helpful, and let them simply fly out of the airfield. And it worked. And the concept worked, but operationally it was probably never deployed, but there was a spin-off of the technologies. And through this, the world of sabotage continued, but there was a necessity and awareness that we had to get into the business of supporting agent operations.
When the CIA was organized in 1947, there was a small group of people called the Technical Aid Staff. And that particular term probably represented fairly accurately the amount of technical thinking that was going into agent operations. This worked for the Office of Policy Coordination, which then became the Directorate of Plans, known now as the National Clandestine Service, for years also known as the Directorate of Operations. These are the folks who do the espionage operations on our behalf. The Technical Services Staff was formed in 1951, primarily at the urging of luminaries such as Dr. Edward Land of Polaroid, Dr. James Killian, who headed MIT, president of MIT, and Stanley Lovell himself. The concept was that by consolidating all of the technical capability that was needed to support espionage operations under one directorship, under one leader, the product would be improved. For all practical purposes, the organization structure, the Office of Technical Staff organizational structure, continued for the next 50 years. In 1973, the office, intact, moved to the Directorate of Science and Technology that had been created 10 years earlier. This was an effort to, again, consolidate all of the technical folks under the management of technical leadership. This is the home of OTS, or was the home of OTS for the majority of its life during its first 50 years. This is also the location of OSS. General Donovan had his offices here, and then the CIA, DCI Dulles, had his offices here until 1961, when the Langley complex was completed. This is a building near the called Medicine Hill next to the State Department by the Kennedy Center. One of the interesting aspects of this building is it is widely reported, credibly reported, that it is haunted with ghosts. Many of the guards who worked there reported frequently to OTS officers that they saw ghosts roaming the halls in the evening. The OTS officers said, "We have no comment." The genius of this office and the organization of this office lie in its ability to blur the line between technology and magic. Particularly for those of us who weren't technically inclined, what we frequently saw we thought was magic. That was partially done because in 1954, the United States faced a crisis, an international crisis, with respect to the increasing influence, the increasing power, the increasing aggressiveness of the Soviet Union. President Eisenhower commissioned a small group of men to look at the U.S. intelligence service at the time, headed by James Doolittle, the pilot who bombed Tokyo in 1942. That report had some pretty strong language for the 21st century. We must learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy our enemies by more clever, more sophisticated, and more effective means than used against us. This led to a program called MK-Ultra. MK-Ultra, authorized initially in 1953 by then-Director Allen Dulles, determined to look at all of the possible means whereby the Soviet influence might affect the United States, including psychological warfare. About 10 years earlier, LSD had been synthesized in Switzerland. In fact, the scientist who synthesized it just died within the last couple of months. LSD was believed at the time to be a possible truth serum, and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, head of then the chemistry division in the technical services staff, was given the responsibility for investigating this substance and determining if that would be applicable to national security. Dr. Gottlieb's experiments with LSD in one particular instance had the most unfortunate outcome in that one of the subjects died after a dose of LSD. And in fact, Dr. Gottlieb carried that moniker unfairly the rest of his life as somehow the Dr. Strangelove of chemistry and bad things and poisons at the CIA. Dr. Gottlieb was in fact a remarkable administrator and leader for the broad Office of Technical Service and widely respected by the officers that served with him. But Dr. Gottlieb took his job seriously, and when the charge came to manufacture certain substances, the question became, how do you deliver the substances? Dr. Gottlieb turned to perhaps the nation's foremost magician at the time, John Mulholland, contracted with John Mulholland and said, can you give us a variety of techniques whereby we can surreptitiously, secretly deliver substances to unsuspecting folks? And in fact, Mulholland did exactly that.
Most of the public was later aware of MK-Ultra a decade or so later. But during the 60s, especially on May the 1st, 1960, the world became aware of a alleged, purported CIA Air Force reconnaissance weather plane that had been lost over the Soviet Union. And it purportedly had strayed off course. Later it would be discovered that the pilot was a CIA pilot, Francis Gary Powers, and remarkable had been the types of equipment he was carrying when he was shot down. This is a clip that will give us an idea.
It brought a young pilot, Francis Gary Powers, to world prominence. He was to photograph the Urals nuclear plants, and then he was to head to Plesetsk. We had never seen Plesetsk.
In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev is shown as he told the Soviet Presidium that pilot Gary Powers of the downed American reconnaissance plane was alive. And Mr. K was picked to play on the incident for propaganda events.
His CIA employers gave him this beautiful pistol, which works without any noise, in case he was shot down. Also, he had some poison in a needle, which he should have used in case he was grabbed by the Russian bears from the KGB. But being a very sensible person, he didn't use the poison.
Now, clearly, this was a huge propaganda victory for the Soviet Union. So, we were not to be outgunned, and this is a unique recording you'll hear now that was very popular on the radios at the days, and to my knowledge, it's the first time it's perhaps been played in almost 50 years.
In the stately Hall of Columns, 1960 was the year when young Francis Gary Powers stood before the Russian bear. They were trying him for spying, or the Soviets he flew in the famous plane U-2.
Makes you want to clap along, doesn't it? So, the question becomes, what about this unusual pen? And the pen was actually developed by CIA in cooperation with a special group within Fort Detrick, Maryland. And like many of you, I have often pondered exactly how was it built and constructed. And I thought perhaps you might like to see a little cross-sectional diagram. This is the pen itself. It was very tiny. It appeared to be a common straight pen. And actually it was hollow. And inside is the needle that contained the poison. If we lift the pen out, we'll notice an interesting configuration for the construction. The shaft is actually from a large hypodermic needle. It had a machine steel tip. The head that you pulled was actually a straight pen, and it had been soldered onto one of the world's tiniest drill bits. And in the grooves was saxitoxin. And saxitoxin, or shellfish poison, is one of the most lethal subjects known to mankind. It's about 1,000 times more lethal than sarin nerve gas. And a lethal dosage for an average human is about 0.8 milligrams. And this was the content. It was never to kill anyone. It was an item that if he chose to commit suicide. But such pills, either they are L pills or something like this, are exceedingly rare and uncommon in the intelligence world. This is one of the images we recently received of paralytic shellfish toxin. It was available in both dry and liquid form, as well as cobra venom. And it showed some of the range of exploration that was done at the time. Now, you're also wondering, how did Gary Powers carry it? And interestingly, it was concealed within the bezel of a silver dollar. And it was a tiny spring, and he would rotate the bezel until it would line up with a hole, and the pin would come out. And he carried it in his pocket. When he landed, he was concerned that it would be considered an assassination device. When he parachuted down, he threw it away in a field. He later told his Russian interrogators, and they went and recovered it. Unfortunately for the dog, they tried on a small dog and killed the dog and proved that it did work. But killing was something that was certainly considered. And under two successive U.S. administrations, that of President Eisenhower and President Kennedy, the CIA and OTS carried out administration policy and considered a wide range of possible plans that could be used for assassination. A recent documentary was done in cooperation with the Cubans that they claimed that there were 638 different ways and different plots that had been used to kill Castro. Our research certainly turns up only a handful, but they were quite innovative and used both as assassination potentially, but also to discredit Castro. And among some of the creative ones are a hallucinogenic spray that could be put in the air about the time he was going to go on television for his long ranting tirades, and it would be used to perhaps make him appear even more unstable. A hallucinogenic cigar, contaminated shoes, and a time that he might, they put thallium salts, depilatory cigars at a time that a man's beard was considered a mark of his virile nature, Poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, contaminated diving suit, a poison pen contaminated with black leaf 40 poison that interestingly was produced by TSD, one of the OTS predecessors, and issued to the agent in Paris to go back to Cuba on the morning that President Kennedy was assassinated. So an interesting convergence. And then suppressed rifles and pistols. But by 1963, virtually all of the plans had stopped. And for the most of the world, it was forgotten about. However, there was an interesting history. To maintain operational cover, the CIA, TSS at the time, had looked at perhaps that it would be hands-off if they engaged in a relationship with some of the underworld figures who had gambling interests in Havana and might also have an interest in seeing Castro eliminated. And through a former FBI agent, retired Robert Mayhew, they contacted such interesting characters as Sam Momo Giancano, Santo Trafficante, and Johnny Rosselli, and they find that they were not effectively organized to do that. There were other plans, Operation Mongoose in '62, and later ZR Rifle in '63. But essentially, they were conceptual plans, only one or two ever went into the point that they were issuing weapons. But most of the world never heard about it until the end of the Watergate era, and an aggressive Idaho senator by the name of Frank Church sought to find out, was there truly a rogue elephant in the U.S., and was this the CIA? And he held on a September committee hearing one of the most infamous weapons of all time that purported to be a CIA weapon, and this is Senator Church.
Does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman.
What range does it have?
Director Colby.
100 meters, I believe, about 100 yards, 100 meters.
As a murder instrument, that's about as efficient as you can get, isn't it?
It is a weapon, a very serious weapon. Well, I thought that it was the very survival was at stake.
This is the weapon being held up by Senator Goldwater. This is actually the non-discernible microbio-inoculator. It just rolls right off of your tongue. And interestingly, it's one of the most infamous non-weapons for CIA that ever existed, because it was actually produced by the Army Security Agency and had been given for evaluation to the CIA, and it had been in Director Colby's safe. He simply, going to appear before the committee, thought it would be of interest. And though it was immediately world famous, few people ever read the report to find out it is not a CIA weapon at all. But it certainly is one that is closely identified with the agency.
A couple of my former colleagues said, well, you know, Bob, we could have done that if we'd have been asked. 1960, 62, 63, three major international security matters faced by the United States. One, the potential nuclear threat from the Soviet Union. Secondly, the influence of the Soviet Union in the Western Hemisphere through Cuba. And third, the growing Vietnam War. With respect to the first, Gary Powers and the U-2, Corona, the early satellites, gave us excellent information about Soviet tanks and about Soviet airfields. The satellites and the U-2s were ineffective at telling us what the Soviet intentions and plans and real capabilities as understood by the Soviet leaders would be. Oleg Penkovsky came on the scene in 1961, a volunteer who had substantial information about Soviet leadership and whose reporting over the 18 months that he was handled as an agent for the British and the United States produced thousands of intelligence reports, and in fact was instrumental in giving President Kennedy the knowledge and the basis for making a decision not to go to war with the Soviet Union but to blockade Cuba. Oleg Penkovsky was arrested in November of 1962, actually a few days earlier, and this is a picture of Colonel Penkovsky at his trial with his Minox 3S camera, which was the primary means that he had to copy and collect information. This is the Minox with the and this is showing how it is used. Okay, I'm sorry.
Спецхран Генерального штаба к документам особой секретности. Список необходимых для пересъемки материалов он получил в Лондоне. Больше всего заказчиков интересовала ракетная техника.
Oleg Penkovsky had very limited technical capability to carry out his espionage. We see here his cameras, his camera bodies, his one-way voice message system that was really based on nothing more than a shortwave radio, which he listened to get his instructions. Oleg Penkovsky's arrest and death was a great blow to American intelligence. We were coming through the incident of the failed Bay of Pigs, now having faced the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a photo of Nels Benson, the one OTS officer in the history of the organization whose life was lost in duty. He was serving at the time with the Cuban group that was planning to invade on the Bay of Pigs. This is just a shot of photo of the Isle of Pines, where the Cubans had a prison that figures prominently in the history of OTS. 3 OTS officers in 1960 were arrested while doing an audio job in Havana, and detained, arrested, tried, not sentenced to death, but sentenced to 25 years in prison each. They were imprisoned at the Isle of Pines, where they lived in luxurious conditions, and during the course of their imprisonment, probably as much as any group of OTS officers demonstrated the ingenuity of what the officers were capable of doing by building radios, by building equipment that effectively interrupted an explosive system that the Cubans had put in the prison as a means to encourage folks not to riot too much, or we would blow this prison up. These CIA officers remarkably held their cover for 2.5 years until they were released in early 1963. And here they are, celebrating a couple of years later and thanking the CIA and the Cuban intelligence service for their unplanned vacation. I mentioned Vietnam. Vietnam gave OTS an opportunity to develop some additional weapons. Here is the Gyrojet, a special pistol that in fact is a rocket gun. And I think we will see...
In a bit of backward design, the Gyrojet hammer strikes the nose of the rocket instead of the butt. This drives the rocket back onto the firing pin, which ignites it. As the rocket launches forward on the hammer, it recocks the weapon. By the time it had traveled 100 yards, the rocket bullet was designed to be 50% more powerful than a slug from a .45.
It was a great weapon. It was shown in one of the Green Beret movies, I believe, maybe with John Wayne, but its accuracy left a little bit to be desired. Special Ops used it from time to time. As far as I know, the CIA did not. But what the CIA did use was the world's quietest helicopter, built by the OTS folks with the contractor help in 1970, 1971. It was a time when Henry Kissinger, as National Security Advisor, had just faced the crisis of the Pueblo and said, we don't have the capability to get people or equipment into places surreptitiously, quietly in the middle of the night. So OTS was charged with the idea of building a quiet helicopter, and in fact they built not only the world's quietest helicopter, one that could not be heard at 500 feet at night, flying at night, and also one that could operate at night. The FLIR technology that came out of this project revolutionized nighttime flying for both the agency and the Air Force.
There was a recognition that with the development we'll see a little later of the transistor in the late 60s, one of the two collection priorities to collect audio had been achieved. But one of the missing links was an improvement on the Minox camera. We had to have a way to doc copy or collect information for documents. And agents are no good unless the information can be communicated. In 1973, a Russian member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Alexander Ogorodnik, was recruited in Bogota, Colombia. And he returned to Moscow in 1975. He was operated under the code name Trigon. He had incredible access to information on strategic developments and trends in Soviet policy. But his secret photographs of documents were made possible by a remarkable camera known as the T100. We talk about it extensively in the book. It used 4mm film. It came in a variety of concealments, and they were active. You could hide it as a fountain pen, a writing pen, as a Cricket cigarette lighter, as a keychain, and also in a watch. And we'll have examples that Bob will hold up and we'll show you later. So the possibility was there. This is called a site map, and this is one of the techniques of drawing that OTS utilized to provide information to an agent where to have a meeting. Now, clandestine meetings or dead drops have two components. One is the signal site by which you activate the meeting, and the second is the information for the dead drop itself. In this unique style of drawing enabled the agent, regardless of language, to understand where the meeting should be. And to give you an idea, that is my picture in the late 1990s of the bridge tower shown. And Trigon was operated in Moscow by one of the first female CIA case officer had been stationed in Moscow. And this was at a time that the Russian counterintelligence was generally very dismissive that women could actually play an important role in intelligence. And the very young woman is Marty Peterson, who played a role as the handler for Trigon. And here she's seen, and it was on a fateful night in 1977 that she was charged with leaving a drop in this bridge tower for Trigon. Now, she was surrounded, arrested. She fought ferociously. In fact, in Moscow, they still talk about the great difficulty they had in containing her to bring her under control. Interestingly, a comment to Bob was, "Oh, shucks, I may have just stepped on someone's foot." But clearly she was there. The great loss was not her because she had diplomatic immunity. It was the fate of Trigon, who we discover now had committed suicide before this dead drop took place. Had an opportunity. This is the actual asphalt dead drop concealment device that is put in the original alcove we did about 1997. And this is the contents, which showed the money and the camera and the film bodies that were being passed to her. Interestingly, inside, this is a translation of the message that the OTS had created. Now, it was in Russian, but if someone had happened to stumble across it in the half an hour it would be in that alcove at night, it's a warning. By chance, you have penetrated into another's secret, having picked up somebody else's parcel and belongings which were not meant to you. Keep the money and gold with you, but do not touch other things in the parcel in order not to know too much and to expose your life and the lives of your nearest and dearest to danger. Take the things which are valuable and toss the others in the river. And that was the message that was found inside. A very clever way in case it had been stumbled upon. And this is Marty Peterson sitting at Lubyanka, the headquarters of Russian counterintelligence, the Second Directorate. And this is after midnight, and she has just been met by the gentleman in the photo to her left, who is from the U.S. Embassy. And interestingly, in Moscow, they still talk about an enlargement of the film. And if you look very carefully, he's wearing 2 wristwatches. Now, they draw the conclusion, perhaps, that one of those is a covert recording system useful to record the conversation at the time. But an interesting application. This is the T100 in the ball pin concealment. It is an active concealment in that it worked as a camera as well as a functioning writing pen. And there it is, opened with the lens exposed. This is the operational use of the camera. Now, what made it remarkable was you could activate it with one finger. And here it's shown, it was the focal distance was 28 centimeters above the document, and it would cover a 36 centimeters diagonal to diagonal. And it was a remarkable piece of precision photographic equipment. These are KGB photographs showing the T-100 being used. And what the agent has done is take simply a little knitting needle, cut to 28 centimeters, and simply put it in a little cloth wrapper to hold it on the camera, and so he could simply hold it with one hand. It's precisely focused and turn the page. Very clever, very, very useful, and very effective. This is the same camera concealed as a keychain, here as it would be carried and open, showing the lens. And truly one of the cameras that won the Cold War. This is a Cricket lighter, and this shows the various components. So very effective. The Cricket lighter did work as well. Recently on Gizmodo.com, they did some drawings showing how that same camera would work in a concealment as a wristwatch. It wasn't quite that obvious. This is actually a Seiko watch that was designed. This is the normal configuration. If you twist the bezel, the faceplate moves, and that's the lens, and here it is open to replace the film. So a remarkable piece of technical accomplishment. Very sophisticated and very practical.
When Penkovsky was arrested in 1962, the CIA had virtually no capability to run agents over a long period clandestinely inside the Soviet Union. In fact, we did not have such a capability to do that consistently until demonstrated with the Trigon case in the mid-1970s. Now, 15 years after Penkovsky's arrest, an aviation engineer attempted to make contact with the agency in Moscow. His name was Adolf Tokolchev. Tokolchev, like many of the volunteers that came our way from the Soviet Union, was initially thought to possibly be a provocation, and so we were very slow in picking up on this volunteer out of concern for the security and safety of our officers who might be meeting them. Nevertheless, when Penkovsky, when Tokolchev satisfied us with his bona fides, we immediately moved to assist him in terms of effectively working as a spy for us inside Moscow. And for the next 5 years, almost 6 years, Tokolchev reported on the most advanced Soviet avionics and aviation plans, weapons, and equipment. He provided us with drawings, he provided us with notes, he provided us with information, and he was able to do that because finally the CIA, specifically the Office of Technical Service, had developed sufficient equipment for an agent to have consistent impersonal communications as well as consistently meet securely with case officers inside Moscow. Tokolchev's array of equipment is illustrated partially in what you are seeing before you, and particularly I would point out that the SHRAC systems that he used, that is short-range agent communications, developed also in the mid-1970s, represented in one sense the first text messaging system that, as far as I know, the world saw. He had his 2 cigarettes box-sized pad that he could punch in information and then transmit it electronically to a case officer anywhere from half a mile to a kilometer away. Tokolchev's arrest came in 1986, as a result of the treachery by Aldrich Ames. The technical systems worked fine.
The CIA had been carefully establishing agents within Soviet intelligence and defense circles. Precious sources, like avionics expert Adolf Tokolchev, seen here on his way to a meeting in Moscow with his CIA contact. the KGB suddenly started to arrest the CIA's most important Soviet spies.
In 1985, we began to lose cases, by which I mean Soviet officials working for us, and some of them disappeared.
Now, I would like to report that this film, this video, came from CIA-installed video cameras inside the KGB's surveillance vans. That would not be correct. This, in fact, is KGB footage that Keith was able to somehow get his hands on, and so I just don't want to leave any misimpression. So, remember the shot we had of the equipment that Penkovsky had? About four different items. Well, by the time we are now with Tukhachev's in the mid-1980s, some 20 years after Penkovsky, this is the array of the kind of technical equipment he could use. Here is his OWVL system with small devices at the top. You will see that are demodulators and for the messages coming in. We have the SRR 100 piece of counter surveillance equipment that could be worn by our officers, and through this they could clandestinely hear the transmissions of Soviet surveillance that was tracking them or other activities of Soviet surveillance. We have film, soft film, primarily coming from the satellite program, used for the site sketches or other communications needing drawings, such as meeting sites as illustrated here. We had an increasing array of concealments that took advantage of Soviet equipment, Soviet automobiles, other Soviet items that were common in the commercial world. What we did not have necessarily were enough officers in the Soviet Union.
One of the great difficulties in operating in a hostile environment such as Moscow was breaking clear of surveillance. And anyone that was communicating directly with an agent, the risk was not to the officer, the handler, because he had diplomatic immunity. But you spent years to find the perfect agent or the agent with access. You could not afford to inadvertently draw surveillance to them. So one of the techniques that was used was to do something called a rollout. If you're driving in Moscow, you're making a series of right-angle turns in the urban setting, a trailing surveillance car would lose sight of you for a few seconds at night when you made the turn. So when you made that turn, your passenger in that few moments in the gap could bail out. Unfortunately, the trailing surveillance car would then see this profile in the headlights, which would be a problem. So the idea was to create a jack-in-the-box. And the jack-in-the-box would be an inflatable person, which quickly you could open a briefcase and they would appear again and you could continue on with your path. Well, this was the challenge. Well, the difficulty was that OTS faces, how do we create this inflatable character? Now, the knowledge base of individuals in the OTS is exhaustive, and quickly they immediately turn to the largest single source of inflatable dolls, which was at a sex shop on 14th Street here in D.C., and two young OTS officers in suits go in and bought a variety of sex dolls, inflatable dolls. They quickly discovered, however, that the necessity, if you open a briefcase, you had a huge rush of gas for it to inflate. Well, the seams on the sex doll wouldn't withstand this quick expansion, and they kept blowing out. So what's the solution? Go back and buy more sex dolls and continue to experiment, until finally there was a reference that they didn't know what to say at the strange look at the proprietor as they kept going through a large number of sex dolls from the shop. Eventually there was solution, and Jack-in-the-Box was deployed. Interestingly, I was noticing that a Japanese inventor came up with almost the same idea called the Road Buddy. so women would have someone, a companion, when driving at night. Now, sadly to tell you, this was not the only experience that CIA had with porno shops, because the other experience was they needed the ability to read microdots. And a microdot is an optical reduction onto film of a page of text with a minimum of a 100-to-1 reduction. And the idea was you can read it with a microscope, but an agent can't have that. So what happened if you could have a tiny viewer, just a little larger than a grain of rice, and you could secrete it in your eye, you could hide it easily, and you could use it, put saliva on the end, touch it to a microdot, hold it up, and you could actually read it. Well, it turns out those devices had been around since the late 1700s. We called them a Stanhope lens or a Coddington magnifier, but there wasn't an availability of them. But once again, research, experience, and knowledge came to bear, and it was discovered that in the adult shops, there was a device called a peep viewer. And in its era, in the 50s, men with bad upbringing, perhaps, would go there to look at risque photographs of women. They could actually take them and hide them in their change pockets, and in moments of privacy, take a look. Now, the images weren't quite that risque, but it turns out this is a peep viewer. You'd look in the end, and that is a demurely, fully clothed woman at the other end, quite risque at the side, at the scene. But what was interesting was that inside was actually a Stanhope lens. And they purchased the first 100 directly there, once again expressing that they had need for a large number of the peep viewers, destroyed them, took a lacquer thinner, removed the risque image, and those were the source of the first bullet lenses that were used by CIA. You'd simply put a microdot on the end and view them. And we do have one on the table here that we would show you as well. Now, one of the most famous pieces, however, once again defined by culture, is the Schrack device used by Get Smart.
Yeah, I need to correct Keith on a couple of things. The Stanhope lenses that OTS purchased did not have the girly figures on them. It had the Lord's Prayer, actually. And so, stand corrected, Keith. Movies and television. Did movies and television influence OTS? I think if it didn't influence OTS, at least it inspired us at certain times. Among those inspirations was the cell phone used by Maxwell Smart, and of course the colleague item used in Mission Impossible, the pen communicator. So how can we think, this is the 1960s, how can we possibly develop a system that would allow an agent and a case officer to communicate electronically just like they did on the movies?
Pardon me, I wonder if you'd mind working on that shoe for a while. Oh, this is smart.
We got the concealment okay. It was the transmission that kept giving us the problem. Another device that we developed about the same time was a counterintelligence receiver. You recall I referred to the receiver that was the square receiver that was held around the neck. Another of those receivers was one that used bone conductivity to transmit the sound. And this is the pipe surveillance receiver. An officer could with an antenna, wearing an antenna around his or her neck, could clamp down on this pipe and actually receive transmissions from other radios.
In Budapest in the early 80s, the CIA recruited a source known as GT Accord. His name was Vladimir Vasiliev. And in 1983 to 85, it was desirable to communicate with him secretly. One of the techniques that was used was to get a European edition of the National Geographic, specifically in this instance, the February 1983 edition, and in a page filled with an ad, they took a line of print. At this point, they purchased a new Hewlett-Packard laser engraver, and in the line of text, they wrote in a slightly off-color gray ink, they engraved at a 30-to-1 reduction information for using his dead drop, and it was a very, very effective way for communication at the time.
Audio became the principal work of OTS in the 1960s and the 1970s. It was based primarily on the integrated circuits that were developed initially in 1958, and this is one of the very first audio transmitters that the agency had available for use by officers in the early 1960s. This is about the size of 2 packs of cigarettes. Now, interestingly, internally, this is known as the SRT-2, and you will notice that there is a vacuum tube, a small vacuum tube still with that. The next generation, the SRT-3, had no vacuum tubes, remarkably reliable, and in fact launched what I would call the era of audio for OTS. These transmitters were literally deployed in the hundreds around the world, bugging embassies, residents, all types of targets that were deemed appropriate by the agency. Again, about the size of 2 packs of cigarettes. They could be installed in wood blocks, such as in a furniture brace. You will recall that about 8 years ago there was an audio device installed in the State Department, here in the conference room of the State Department, a common technique in the sense of using some type of wood to bury your audio equipment. Now, you face the problem of the other guys collecting against you, collecting audio against you, so we need some way to protect our communications. And again, let's turn to Get Smart.
Isn't this top security? Yeah. Well, shouldn't we activate the cone of silence?
Max, I've been having a little mechanical difficulty with it lately, and
Don't be ridiculous, Chief. The whole thing is so simple. All you have to do is press this button and turn this lever all the way to the right.
Now, here's our plan.
Hold it, Chief. Okay, go ahead.
First, you take Tanya to your apartment. Make sure you're not being followed, except, of course, by our own men. Meanwhile, I will take 99, disguised as Tanya, to a commercial hotel. We'll register 99, and we'll sneak her out of the hotel, making sure that some of our men stay behind to guard her room as a decoy. Have you any questions?
No, Chief, I think that just about covers everything.
This last scene reminds me of the plexiglass secure room that in fact OTS did create, and we deployed that around the world to protect our conversations from listening, and when you went in it, you felt about as crowded as Max and the Chief must feel here.
The audio collection was so important. Among the interesting technologies it faced was if you want to hide a microphone, you want to get it to a transmitter or a recorder, but you need to run the wires. Either you can hide them behind the baseboards where that's desirable, but in some instances you had no choice but to run them across an open section of wall. This is called a fine wire kit, which was essentially an early portable cable burying system in which you had a razor blade that would move across an open section of wall, 2 wires would be inserted in the wall, and an eraser would close the incision behind it, and you could literally string wires, not much more in diameter than a human hair, across an open section of wall. Very creative, very effective, but with all the audio technology, you often couldn't get close to a target, and in the 60s, a target was a Asian head of state. He had a beloved cat that was allowed to roam free into the office, as several cats. And the idea was, how can we convert a feral cat to a programmable, movable target audio acquisition system and actually make it work? Well, it turns out that it was done. And in the report that was eventually released, there were some results. Number one, it was a remarkable scientific achievement. Cats can be trained to move short distances, and only environmental and security factors make it impractical overseas. That translates to the fact that, yes, we can train the cat. Yes, the technology works for the listening device. The problem is, we can't anticipate during the training the operational needs in the office configuration that you might find later. Now, this was kind of humorously cartooned from the Gizmodo site, but I thought you might like to see the image of the cat. And what makes it special was the audio device was inserted into the skin beneath the neck, the soft skin. The microphone was actually in the ear canal, and the transmitter ran down the back of the spine. It is said that one of the TSD officers at the time passed out in the veterinarian's office, but the cat came through fine, lived a long, healthy, and natural life, and despite the accusation in a book later by Victor Marchetti, the cat was not run over operationally as it crossed the road to go into the building. But it's an example of the creativity that was in place. Thanks to our friends at the agency, we'd like to show you, however, what could be done if you have the need for a robotic catfish. And this is actually one of the mechanized robotic collectors at CIA. And the idea would be, what if you had a submarine, wanted to perhaps launch one of these using GPS? You had a river, foreign country, let it swim up the river, and perhaps check the effluent coming out near a nuclear facility. You might be able to perhaps take a radiological survey into the amount of radiation there. But very interesting, innovative technology. But where rivers are somewhat limited, what if we could put one in the air? Well, actually, in the 70s, the CIA was one of the pioneers of that. And this is the famous UAV Dragonfly. And we have one of the prototype models on display. It's about 3 inches long. It's the retroreflector. It's the optical fibers, the switching circuitry, the actuators, and the intake valve, and the optical fibers, and the forward retroreflectors, and the sensor. And this is actually the wind test tunnel model showing it flying. A remarkable scientific achievement. This was characterized in one of the Gizmodo cartoons, but this is actually a photograph of the device in camouflage, and we have one over here on the table, and that's the line drawings of the Insectothopter. Those are the actual prototype models. But what if you're in Moscow and you want to have an impersonal communication meeting, and you want to drive your car slowly at the predetermined corner? Surveillance doesn't have you in their headlights. You roll down the window and you toss the dead drop out on the Russian street. Well, what type of a device might you be comfortable that no one would ever pick up? Well, what if you could come up with a freeze-dried, gutted rat, and you could use it as a container? Now, being sensitive, we've actually brought one with us today. And this is an official CIA rat. At the conclusion of the program, you're welcome to have your photograph made with the rat. He lived a normal, a full, healthy life, and only in his advancing years did he volunteer his services to the agency. There is a cavity inside. Now, interestingly, if you drop this out, what fear would you have tossing it out on the street full of microfilm or money for the agent? What concern would you have? A hungry cat And so one of the techniques utilized by very clever officers in Moscow was soak it in Tabasco sauce. Cats will not touch dead rats soaked in Tabasco. Perhaps file that away for future reference.
The other problem was, how do you get a North Korean rat? And this isn't a joke, because if you needed a rat in North Korea, it'd be fairly hard to capture one of those. So the answer to that was, we took white rats, and with proper applications of Miss Clairol, well, you could make a rat look like about whatever country it might originate from. When you're a CIA officer and you write a book, there is one requirement in addition to submitting the manuscript for review, and that is there must be an official message from the CIA in that book disclaiming all responsibility for anything that is written. And it's called the CIA disclaimer. It's required. Well, we've read a lot of CIA books in our life, and you get tired of reading the same disclaimer again and again and again. So we thought we would like to have it appear in a little different form. So in Spycraft, you will find the official CIA disclaimer, but you won't find the exact words unless you apply your skills as a cryptologist and decrypt this message, which we provide you with the 5-group message, and on another page, actually, I'll go ahead and say this, right? I say, another thing you find in writing books is that there's always the mistake that you don't want to be made. So when you see the message, it says go to page 99. That's not correct. You're supposed to go to page 97 to get the one-time pad to decode it. So for those of you who picked up the book, that is one hint. And here is the one-time pad, the page from the one-time pad that will be used to decode the message. Digital convergence. We talked when we started this presentation that the digital revolution had in fact altered the way technical people are going to do intelligence for the future. Here again, you recall this from an earlier slide. These are all the pieces of equipment that was used by Tokolchev, the officer, the agent who we said was a successor to Penkovsky. Well, what today could replace some of these items? Here's the cameras, you know, the radio, the surveillance radio, the notepad, the pen, a camera body, the soft film. There's a cricket lighter, another sight sketch, some water-soluble paper, a notebook, the concealment rock, another item who I've momentarily forgotten what it is, but it was important at the time. And of course, another radio receiver. This replaces it. Your BlackBerry, your iPhone, depending on your preference. So one of the last things I did as director of OTS, not knowing that it was going to be one of the last things I did, but it turned out to be, was down at Congress one day briefing the committees, the Senate committee, in fact, on some of the new techniques, new technologies that OTS was developing. I'd briefed Congress a number of times, many times during my career at the agency, and one of the things that you found was that if you could give a congressman something he or she could hold in their hand, you could distract their attention and you could get the approval then for whatever you were proposing. In fact, the Congressional Oversight Committee folks were intensely interested in the capabilities of the agency. I found them remarkably supportive during the time that I was involved with the Office of Technical Service. We showed them the gadgets, we showed them how it worked, we told them the operational stories, we told them why we needed either improvements or different kinds of pieces of gear, and they were remarkably receptive. Well, on that last briefing, it occurred to me that we were changing very rapidly in the Office of Technical Service. This digital convergence was on us. The Internet, which was now almost 10 years old, was having the same effect on intelligence that the Gutenberg Press probably did on the intelligence folks of the 13th or 14th century. So I took a couple gadgets along, and they were interested in them, and then I said, wait one moment, please. I said, you know, all of this stuff, all of this equipment that I have shown you, it's fascinating stuff, and I can tell great stories about it, and you can look at it, and you can marvel at it, you can ooh and awe about it, but in fact, in the future, this is what I think the director of the Office of Technical Service is going to bring down to show you. The problem, I think, will be how do we convince you that this is really spy gear? Well, ladies and gentlemen, today this in fact is the core of what intelligence agencies are doing to spy. So might take that as a final word from this presentation. Now, Keith, I'd like to thank Keith, my colleague. All of these wonderful graphics and video you've seen are the direct result of Melton Productions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you have been very patient. If there are any questions, we would just be delighted to give you some comments. Amanda has a microphone. We have microphones on both sides. So, any Q&A? We've done such an exhaustive job that there are no questions. Yes, sir. Yeah, she'll give you.
We have more stuff.
I was just going to say, is it that ever, like, such as the T100 microphone, the SR R100 receiver, are anything such as those going to ever be for sale?
Sir, if they are, I'm there first. But realistically, not in this country. Occasionally, items show up overseas, but you know, that's why the International Spy Museum is here, and probably it's certainly the finest public resource, and it's a very enthusiastic group. We appreciate their sponsorship, and you'll find many of the items we showed and discussed you'll find on display there. So hopefully you'll enjoy going through that. Any other questions? Well, yes, sir.
I was just curious how you are able to power the dragonfly and the fish, such a small mechanical system.
Sir, that is a great question. I'm so delighted that you asked that. Any other questions? Sir, it was a prototype, and there's a variety of different engines that they use. And if you've kept up with events now, they're deploying similar devices in Iraq to go inside buildings in advance of troops. And DARPA has the Advanced Project Group has now a device about the size of the end of your finger, a tiny black fly. So development and technology continues. What's remarkable is this was done in the 1970s.
Well, let me add to that in fact power sources, batteries, were often the long pole in the tent when it came to audio, when it came to communications, when it came to any kind of sensors. There was a saying within OTS that when the battery dies, the operation dies. And that could not have been more true. The substantial effort of OTS's engineering programs during the 1970s and 1980s were focused on batteries. And in fact, the lithium battery that is widely used today grew out of a lot of OTS research that was done during the 1970s. In addition, the hearing aid batteries that you use, the impact and the ability of those hearing aid batteries to withstand the somewhat hostile environment of the ear came out of OTS research in the 60s and 70s. And finally, take a lot of pride in this, Keith, the pacemaker batteries. The original pacemaker batteries really came out of a design by OTS.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Cal.
Yeah, I think in the past, Yes, I think in the past, and this modern generation, I think, is more than receptive to technology and innovation. I don't think it's always been that way, and I was just wondering, I'd like to ask Bob the question, did you find that in the technology that your office could provide in support of operations, that you had to often convert people, or that you found yourself having to market your product?
The real issue with the devices, I think, was less the technology than with would they consistently and reliably work in the operational environment. Unfortunately, some of those environments were exceedingly hostile in terms of temperature, humidity, abuse by the agent, and even once in a while abuse by a case officer. I think it was Richard Helms that said, despaired in when one of his books, making the comment that one of the things that OTS had to do was develop equipment that would withstand impact because a case officer was always going to drop it. One of the great stories of OTS was we developed a device. This was a concealment for an agent. And concealments are designed so you either push, pull, twist, and usually you have to do these either in sequence or simultaneously. And so we developed this very fine concealment for a first top-notch agent. We said it has to be super secure. We delivered it to the case officer, sent it to the field, and a few weeks later we heard the report back, what are you guys thinking about? This guy can't use a concealment. We said, of course, we've tested it, it works fine. And he said, well, didn't we tell you his hands are arthritic? Well, no, we hadn't known that. So in fact, designing the devices frequently requires knowing the agent and the agent's capabilities.
Any other questions? Josh, then Amanda will give you that.
I was just wondering what your personal favorite device that you've been involved with in creating, and what device is your personal favorite that you've collected?
I wasn't involved in creating it, but I think my favorite device of the 200 or so that we describe and talk about in the book is the bullet mic. I mean, I love the bullet mic idea. This was a Soviet intelligence officers were meeting in a Soviet compound in South America. This was, again, a number of years ago. During the summertime, they would come out and sit under a tree, a bench under a tree inside the compound. Well, the compound was fenced, but it wasn't walled. So actually, there was line of sight from outside the fence to the tree. And I'm sure this was a case officer idea. I don't think a tech would have thought about that. The case officer said, well, if we just put a microphone in a bullet and shoot it into the tree, well, we could get audio from their conversations. Well, the techs don't know how to say no. Yeah. And he said, okay, sure, we'll take this on. And in fact, worked with an American microphone manufacturer, and they developed a mic that would withstand the impact of a bullet, had an antenna, had a little power source on it, had a little transmitter on it, and it worked. They tested it in a quarry out near Baltimore, and by golly, they were getting decent audio. Problem was, they shot it into a piece of plywood. And what we found is if you shoot it into a tree, the fibers in the tree react differently than the fibers in the plywood. And so it wouldn't transmit effectively in a tree. So the project was abandoned, but it's really one of my favorites.
Josh, the warm affection for the rat, it's hard for me to get around that. So I hope you'll have your picture made with that later. Yes, ma'am.
How would you compare your counterparts' capabilities in the KGB to what you write about?
So it's a very perceptive question. As far as originality and creativity, I believe that the Russian intelligence, their technical operation officers were superb. And they were capable of incredibly ingenious and effective designs. Where OTS set the standard, however, was it had the ability to execute the design and not just produce one or two handcrafted items, but produce them in quantity, because we were going out to private manufacturers and contractors and saying, we want to buy 1/4% of the production at Kodak for a day and produce 500 cameras. In the Russian system, they would have to find land, find a building, barter for the equipment, train people, produce it, and by the time they've done this over a couple of year period, the piece may be obsolete, but they were so invested they had to continue. The U.S. model that started in World War II and continued was leverage the U.S. economy and leverage our contractors to do what they do, and let the ingenuity and the design come from OTS. So I think that history has shown was decisive, but we never want to be dismissive for the other side, because often in the absence of this creative, this infrastructure of production, they substitute a great deal of ingenuity, and they had some remarkable successes.
The one point I'd add to that, the arrogance of the technical people got slapped down early in the history of OTS, because the Russians put that passive cavity resonator in the Great Seal that went in the U.S. ambassador's office in the Soviet Union in 1945. We didn't find it until 1952, 7 years later, and 5 years after that, we still hadn't quite figured out how it worked. There was an IG report, a CIA IG report of 1957, that said the impact of the discovery of this unknown listening device in the American ambassador's office, the impact of that is still resonating throughout the U.S. intelligence community. So many of the OTS officers, the long-term OTS officers, were young engineers at the time. They remembered that incident very well. And so in one sense, that was a wake-up call to them, and I think dampened perhaps what otherwise might be considered technological arrogance.
And by the way, we have a passive cavity resonator and the seal on display here in the museum as well. I believe the gentleman at the back. Yes, sir.
With the rise today of commercial espionage, how good is non-government sponsored technology today?
We start initial. Well, most of the private sector spy shops exist because the greatest threat any of you have, well, most of you, some are exceptional, of being spied upon is the person you look across on the pillow and say goodnight to before you go to sleep. And spy shops exist for husbands and wives to spy on each other. And in this country, sophisticated audio devices in the private sector are unknown. Now, that's changing a bit in Eastern Europe, where you have in some countries, such as Russia, members of their intelligence service that are retired and are using first-line equipment against commercial targets. So overseas, it's a formidable problem. Here in this country, it has been very understated. But the equipment that you see in the spy shops, it's not the level that OTS would have designed.
That's true, and I would add that the commercial equipment has remarkable uses, value to us, particularly in short-term tactical situations. There's really two aspects to today's technical service, and that's one, support for the war on terrorism and the tactical kinds of things that need to be done to counter and defeat terrorists, and the other is the continuing requirement to counter or to conduct espionage against major countries.
Any other questions? Well, with that, we'll declare victory, and thank you very much. Yeah.
Robert Wallace is a former director of the CIA's Office of Technical Service and the founder of Artemis Consulting Group. Keith Melton is a historical consultant for the CIA and a professor at the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies. For more information, visit CIA SPYCRAFT.com.